The last time I looked at the Volkswagen ID.4, I was only able to get my hands on it for 48 hours. This time, I've had it for a complete week. I've been able to road test it. I've also been able to DC fast charge it. In this video, let's go about things a little bit differently. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab the camera here and let's take a look around the ID.4 and talk about the things that I like and don't like. I really like the headlight design, and I have to say I like the general design of the ID.4. This really looks modern, but it also looks distinctively Volkswagen. We have some really cool touches all the way around the vehicle, like these headlights. This is the first edition model, so things are a little bit different here than in the rest of the trims, but you can see we have sort of a honeycomb-like thing going on there with those lights. These do steer in the corners. We have a very distinctive accent light strip, and if you get one of the trims currently available, you can get an illuminated Volkswagen logo up front as well. One interesting touch with this vehicle is that we don't have anything like active grille shutters at the bottom like we do find in a lot of EVs or other high-efficiency vehicles. I was a little bit surprised by that, but Volkswagen says that they're really trying to keep the cost of the ID.4 down. I should also mention that Volkswagen would like you to think of the ID.4 not just as an electric vehicle, but as an electric alternative to something like the RAV4 or the CR-V. And as a result, they've decided to style this a little bit more like the average compact crossover. So we have roof rails up here, and the general design is definitely a bit boxier than we see out of modern Teslas or the Ford Mustang Mach-E. We have a rear end that looks an awful lot like the rest of the Volkswagen lineup. You can see we have red turn signals over there on that side, a strong LED bar that connects the two, and just a single hatchback here. So there is no front trunk in the ID.4. That is one of the things that I complained about the last time that I reviewed this. Now the cargo area is pretty generously sized. As you can see, I could definitely put a decent number of bags in here. You can also insert that cargo floor in a lower position, take it completely out, or I can put it in this upper position and then reserve the underfloor storage for other small knickknacks like that charge cord. And then going completely down the rabbit hole, we find another storage area there. That's where they intend you to put that charge cord. That's why I've had a little charge cord icon right there on that little grab handle. But I think most people are probably just going to stuff it right there under that load floor. This is a very generously sized cargo area. It's pretty similar to what we see in the RAV4 and CR-V, and I was able to fit more bags back here than I was able to fit in the Mustang Mach-E, but it doesn't have a cargo area up front, as I said. In case you're wondering, the ID.4 is rated to tow. There's a teeny tiny tow hitch right down here available, and the rating is 2,200 pounds. Now keep in mind that even if you're towing something relatively aerodynamic like a teardrop camper trailer, you should expect your range to be nearly cut in half. As far as I know, Volkswagen has not commented specifically on why the ID.4 does not get a front cargo area, but there are a few logical reasons. The first one is this area is not terribly large. You'll notice that the front axle in the ID.4 is pretty close to the front. It's right about here in the vehicle. And in the all-wheel drive version of the ID.4, there's going to be a second motor up front. The other reason, of course, is that there's still a bunch of stuff that needs to live under the hood. The HVAC system, the 12-volt battery that even electric vehicles have, the cooling for the battery systems, the air conditioning system, etc. So even if they were able to stuff one under here, it wouldn't be a terribly large one. When you compare the ID.4's profile to some other EVs that do have larger front trunks, you'll notice that they generally have much longer hoods. That's really obvious when you compare this to a Model Y or a Ford Mustang Mach-E. The hood is much longer. And so logically, Volkswagen, instead of giving us cargo up here, just shortens the hood and gives us a cargo area back there. Now, yes, Volkswagen could likely have miniaturized some of the components in here. They could have shrunk them down, squished things around, and then inserted a relatively small cargo area up front where possibly you could have put the charge cord. But that, when you think about it, would have cost more money, because to miniaturize the components and have less commonality with the rest of the Volkswagen envelope would have cost more, not just to design, but also to manufacture, and that would have increased the MSRP. Now, to be clear, I would love to see a teeny tiny storage area up front where I could put the vehicle's charge cable. I do find that really, really handy, but I completely understand why Volkswagen didn't. Volkswagen is targeting first-time EV adopters with the ID.4. So let's talk about the thing that seems to be on most EV shoppers' minds: charging. Charging happens behind door number 1 right here. We have a J1772 charging connector. That's the most common charging connector in the US right now. And for DC fast charging, that's where you would get 60 miles in 10 minutes in this vehicle. It uses the SAE combo standard for DC fast charging. That is currently the biggest DC fast charge standard in the United States. There are more connectors and more stations, it seems, than on the Tesla supercharger network, although exact details are a little bit tricky to get. But this is definitely the fastest growing network. There are more CCS chargers being installed every year than Tesla superchargers. Like most EVs and plug-in hybrids, the ID.4 comes with an EVSE. This is not technically a charger. The charger is actually built into the vehicle itself. This is basically a smart extension cord. It tells the vehicle what kind of power is available to it and conducts the charge to the car. This is the charge connector that most folks will be using. You'll be using this 95 to 100% of the time, depending on the kind of mileage you put on your vehicle. Now, the one that comes with the ID.4 is the slowest cable available for the ID.4. If you have a completely dead battery and you plug it into this connector, it will be consuming about the same amount of power as your average hairdryer, and it will take several days to completely charge your ID.4. Although some people will be just fine with this connector, you'll gain about 3 miles of range per hour that the vehicle is plugged in. I suspect most folks will probably want at least a slow level 2 charger. Charge times for a level 2 EVSE will vary wildly depending on the level 2 EVSE and its output that you get, but you could charge this as quickly as completely empty to completely full in about 7.5 hours. I suspect that most folks will be just fine with a relatively inexpensive level 2 charger. Keep in mind that to charge this as fast as possible, you will need a 48-volt EVSE. Those are about $700 to $1,000. You'll also need a 60-amp circuit and an appropriate electrician to wire that in. So it is going to be a lot more expensive than simply using your dryer outlet in your garage, getting an EVSE rated for that, and one of those fancy wall splitters that will automatically decide whether the dryer gets power or the car gets power. Most folks will be just fine with the ID.4 if you get that set up. And in that situation, this will take about 10 to 11 hours to completely charge from empty to completely full. Of course, most Americans only commute 16 miles a day each way to the office, so 32 miles total. You could actually do that with this cable right here and about 10 hours of charging. I know a decent number of people that daily commute with their EVs longer distance than that, and they just have an EVSE like this. They charge their battery to 90% over the weekend, and then over the week the battery slowly starts dropping down because even though they're plugging it in at night, it's not quite enough to recover by the morning, but by the time the next weekend rolls around, it's able to completely fill up on a Saturday. But again, if you're concerned about that, install a level 2 EVSE at home. Now, you should know that again, this does not come with a level 2 EVSE, but there are some electric vehicles that do. Now to DC fast charging. DC fast charging gets all the attention in the media, it seems. This will never charge as quickly as a Tesla Model 3 or Tesla Model Y. The charge rate of this one is about 100 kilowatts lower, so about 50% lower than the absolute peak rate of the Model 3 and Model Y. The difference, however, is not enormous. You will spend an extra 20 minutes on average at a DC fast charge station if you're doing a road trip in this every single stop than in a Tesla Model 3 or Model Y. But most Americans don't go on road trips that are terribly long when you take a look at the numbers. If that describes you, then this may not be a good fit. But if you are the average consumer, really think about how many road trips you take a year, how far they actually are, and this is likely going to fit into your life a lot easier than you might think. There's another thing you should think of, and that is the cost of DC fast charging. Volkswagen's covering it for 3 years. So even if you live in an area with infrequent access to level 1 or level 2 charging, you may actually be just fine in the ID.4 if you're willing to spend a little bit of time DC charging. You could go to an Electrify America station, spend 30 to 40 minutes there every week, and get a completely free top-up. And depending on your particular situation, you may find that road trips are actually just fine in a vehicle like this, even if you have to stop a little bit more regularly, simply because the cost of electricity is going to be zero on those longer road trips. In my mind, most EVs in the US fall into 2 categories: compliance and compliance adjacent, and then luxury/performance EVs. The ID.4 is really neither of these categories. In the compliance category, we have anything really with under 150 miles of range, in my opinion, especially vehicles that were designed on regular passenger car platforms that were converted for electrification later. Also, pretty much anything that is sold exclusively in California and California ZEV states. That's about 12 states in the US that follow California's ZEV rules. Then we have the luxury performance vehicles. These may or may not be based on existing car platforms, but they're certainly designed to be an exclusive piece of electric machinery. This would be where we find the Polestar 2. Pretty much all of the Tesla lineup, something like the Jaguar I-Pace, etc., they're designed to be distinctive, futuristic. They're designed to be performance-oriented vehicles as well. This is where the Ford Mustang GT falls into, for instance. But interestingly enough, I would say that the base versions of the Ford Mustang and the base ID.4 are 2 of really the first vehicles in the US that don't fall into either of these worlds, because this was designed to be a compact crossover in the vein of the Volkswagen Tiguan that just so happens to be electric. So even though Volkswagen may create crazy fast EVs at some point in the future, that's not what the ID.4 was about. Even the upcoming crazy fast version, if you want to think of that version of the ID.4 worldwide, is going to go 0 to 60 in about 6 seconds. It's nowhere near what we see the Tesla Model Y performance. But this is going to be an awful lot less expensive. Yes, I know there are discount versions of the Model Y you can buy off the menu, etc., etc., etc. Any way you slice it, this ID.4 is always going to be less expensive than a comparable Tesla Model Y. I have personally owned EVs. I currently have an EV right now. I also have a hydrogen vehicle that can't leave the state and seems to blow some people's minds when I make the comment that if I'm going to go more than 350 miles or so away from where I am right now, I'm going to take a plane. I'm probably not going to drive there. So personally for me, and if you're like me, then the road trip range is going to not be a huge deal. If you are planning on doing things like driving from the San Francisco Bay Area to Southern California, you can do that in the ID.4. You will stop either once or twice to charge, depending on the route that you take and how fast you drive. The first DC fast charge stop will take about 40 minutes. You can go to a restaurant, go to the bathroom, whatever, chill out in your car, watch some YouTube. And then the next stop will likely only need to be a 10 to 20 minute charge in order to kick it on into your final destination. Then assuming that you're stopping somewhere like family or friends where you can say, hey, can I plug in my electric car? You can just plug this in and charge the battery back to completion while you're there. Or if you're staying at a hotel, you could use the J1772 connector at the hotel. You can use a Tesla tap adapter to charge this at a Tesla destination charger. Or you could simply wait for the return trip and DC fast charge for free at Electrify America stations. Electrify America is certainly the road trip network. Not only do they have the highest number of fast DC fast charge stations in the United States, they also have a layout that very much mimics the Tesla supercharger layout. I get asked this frequently, but no, at the moment you cannot charge anything but a Tesla at a Tesla supercharger station. However, you can plug an ID.4 or most other EVs into a Tesla destination charger. Those are going to be the smaller ones that you'll find on the wall at hotels, wineries, restaurants, etc. Now, you won't be able to just plug it right into the port on the car. You will need an adapter, but those adapters are readily available online. The interior of the ID.4 is simultaneously familiar and futuristic. All the controls feel very much like other Volkswagen models, but there are some key differences. So over here, for instance, we don't have 4 window switches, we just have 2, and then we have a touch section that activates the rear window switch. There's just a touch button for the lock functionality, touch buttons over there for the headlight switches, touch buttons on the steering wheel, but the layout of the steering wheel is very familiar, and you have all the controls where you'd expect them to be. Lane keeping there, cruise control, enable, disable, the distance set button, change the modes there for the adaptive cruise control system, infotainment buttons over here on the right. There's an instrument cluster where you'd expect an instrument cluster to be, but it's a full LCD. It is a little on the small side, I have to say. I wish that was just a little bit bigger. The shifter is a nod to the futurism. We have drive and brake up there, reverse back like that, and then park is that button right over there. There's an infotainment system where you'd expect it to be, and it's shaped like the ones that we find in other vehicles. Although it is perched a little high on the dashboard, we do have smartphone integration, and this entire system feels a little bit smartphone-like, to be honest. There's a square button right there for the home screen. And although the software has a futuristic skin to it, it feels very much like the software that we find in other Volkswagen Group products. Over here on this vehicle option, we see really the only EV changes versus any other Volkswagen out there. This is our trip computer readout, basically. This gives us miles per kilowatt hour. There's a charging screen. This is the only place you'll find a battery state of charge in percent rather than simply in miles. You can reduce the AC charge current, and it will tell you how long you have to charge. Now, the one thing I did notice with this system, hopefully this will be changed, is that if you go somewhere on navigation, for instance, if I just say Los Angeles here, just type this one in. There we go, Los Angeles, California. It's about 300 miles according to this away. It's really going to be longer by the time we actually put that destination on there. It will calculate a route and insert chargers, but the chargers aren't always the ones that you might think you should be stopping at. So for instance, if we pull up this one, it's going to stop at a 350 kilowatt charger. That's definitely a good thing, but it's also going to stop at a 50 kilowatt charger, which I think is a little bit odd because there are faster charging stations available. Volkswagen is refining this. This is something that I noticed the first time I drove it, and I have to say they've already updated that a little bit, so it definitely seems to be better than the first time I tried it. Below that, we have air vents we'd expect them to be, large cup holders, etc. There's a storage area here with a lot of room, 2 USB inputs. These look like they could be used as additional cup holders. These dividers are removable. This interior is eminently practical, but again, also somewhat futuristic looking in the way that they've made use of the floor space, the storage areas, etc. But interestingly enough, we don't have a completely flat floor right up front. There is just a little bit of a hump and this small little barrier right there between the footwells. Large glass moonroofs are definitely very in vogue with EVs, but Volkswagen gives us one with a twist. It actually has a shade that is almost completely opaque. You can see just through it there a little bit, but that really cuts down the sunlight into this cabin far more than we see in any other EV with a full glass roof, because most of them don't have shades. I'm looking at you, Tesla and Ford. In this video, the drive section is split into two parts. First, there's a range test. With any new EV that I test here at Alex & Autos, if it has an EPA range of 250 miles or more, I put it through my 244-mile EV test loop. This barely completed it. I will give you a little bit of a spoiler there. And then I take this out on my usual road course and talk about how it handles and how it compares. I'm now at the halfway point in the journey. According to the car, I've gone 122 miles of a 244-mile round trip. And according to the range-o-meter here on the instrument cluster, I still have 150 miles of range left. So things are looking really good at this point. And I should note that things are looking a little bit better than they were in the Tesla Model Y at this point in the journey. Keep in mind that the Ford Mustang Mach-E has a bigger battery pack if you get the optional extended range battery, and that's the big reason that it will go further than a lot of EVs out there. It's also looking like this is going to be a little bit better than the Audi e-tron. According to the infotainment system, I've been averaging 3.2 miles per kilowatt hour, which is a little bit better than a number of EVs out there. Most EVs currently on sale in the United States will average between 3 and 3.5 miles per kilowatt hour. The most efficient out there, when driven gently, will approach 4 miles per kilowatt hour, but most of the vehicles that have battery packs about this size and ranges over 200 miles in the 200 to 300 mile real-world range are going to have very similar efficiency to the ID.4. According to the nav system, I am now 13 miles from my start point, and according to the range-o-meter, I have 14 miles of range. So it looks like this vehicle is going to be absolutely spot on in terms of its EPA range estimates. According to the EPA, this particular model is rated for 250 miles. This round trip is 244 miles. So it looks like my real-world number is going to be 245, but stay tuned. I will let you know in 13 miles. Things could not have been closer. I am pulling in to the start of this test, and the battery has just reached 0% and 0 miles estimated of range. And according to my trip computer right here, I've gone 244 miles. As always, there's a caveat here, and that caveat is that your mileage will vary. Keep in mind that I live in a fairly mild climate. If you live in an area of the country that's colder, then anything that uses a heat pump in the EV segment is probably going to give you a longer real-world range. Now let's get to the numbers. 0 to 60 happened in 7.3 seconds in this model, 60 to 0 in 118 feet. I get asked quite frequently, why is it that sometimes 0 to 60 and 60 to 0 numbers move around a little bit, even though you're testing theoretically the same vehicle? Well, there's a lot that goes into this. Traction, the weather, the vehicle's condition, how old the tires are, how new the tires are, etc. There's always going to be a little bit of variation. So you should never take a look at any 0 to 60 number ever, especially if they're testing manual transmissions, as an absolute hard and fast rule. It will depend on your altitude, it will depend on the vehicle's condition, the tires, the traction, all that sort of stuff. 7.3 seconds puts this right in the thick of things for the compact crossover category, whether we're talking about a Toyota RAV4 hybrid or just the average non-hybrid entry in the compact crossover category. You should know, however, that something like the Toyota RAV4 Prime is unexpectedly quick. Just not when it's in EV mode. When it's in EV mode, it is pretty darn slow. It's about 2 seconds slower than this if you simply want to stay in EV mode. If, however, you let the gas engine turn on, it is going to be significantly faster than this. This is, however, much faster than something like a Nissan Rogue. Thanks to the battery's positioning in the ID.4, even though curb weight is pretty high for a compact crossover, the weight is evenly distributed front and rear, and it's very low in the vehicle. That really gives this a great handling dynamic, something that we also see in some of the other performance EVs out there. But this is a much less expensive EV, and it's combined with a really quite comfortable ride. A ride that feels very much like the CR-V or RAV4, but handling characteristics that feel better. When you get out on a rougher gravel road like the one that I'm on here, you'll really notice the difference between the ID.4 and I would say the average big battery EV, something like the Model Y or the Ford Mustang Mach-E. The best way to describe the ride quality in most big battery EVs, especially those with a slightly sportier bent like the Model 3, the Model Y, the Mustang Mach-E, etc., is firm and bouncy. And that's because the vehicles are relatively heavy. They're trying to give them a sporty driving dynamic, and because of aerodynamic profiles and other realities, they don't really have that much suspension travel. And in order to dampen motions of a 5,000-pound vehicle, you need at least a little bit of suspension travel. In the ID.4, although I don't have exact specifications, it appears that this vehicle gives us a little bit more suspension travel. And based on just the tire dimensions on this vehicle, we also have a little bit more cushion in terms of rubber. Volkswagen has also tuned the suspension to feel a little bit more average crossover-like. So this soaks up some of the larger and smaller imperfections better than most EVs out there without having that same sort of bouncy, firm feeling that we find in the average Tesla. The thing that impressed me most with the ID.4 has to be the ride quality, because this doesn't have that firm and bouncy feel that we find in so many EVs. This is going to be far more normal and easier to live with, frankly, than a wide variety of big battery EVs. There's also the turning radius. I don't have to pull very far off this road, maybe just about right here, to completely make a U-turn on the pavement. This has an incredibly tight turning radius. If you live in the city or you live in suburbia, this is likely to be able to make a U-turn on the vast majority of suburban roads. Even your average 2-lane residential road with a little bit of street parking on the side perhaps, this will be able to U-turn in places that other vehicles simply can't. Starting at $39,995, Volkswagen has priced the ID.4 fairly aggressively, but not as aggressively as some might have hoped. Now bear in mind, it does qualify for the full $7,500 federal tax credit. That has run out for Tesla and General Motors. It is rumored that we may get an extension to that tax credit in some form or another sometime later in 2021, but at this point in time, you are going to get a tax credit on the ID.4, and you will not on the Bolt EUV, or the Tesla Model Y. With that out of the way, let's dive into the competition, and very clearly, the first competitor has to be the Tesla Model Y. The Model Y is not only the best-selling EV in America right now, it's the best-selling EV crossover by a long shot as well. Now, the Model Y does not have a federal tax credit anymore, and really at its heart, it's quite a different vehicle. Because the Model Y is the EV for some. It starts at $51,990. Theoretically, there is an off-menu standard range version that is just under $40,000 supposedly. I haven't been able to get my hands on any of those in the wild. I'm sure they do exist, but production is very limited, not too many people have them, and we don't know exactly how long Tesla will keep offering them. In reality, the vast majority of Tesla Model Ys will be somewhere in the mid-$50,000 range. It's a very different kind of vehicle. It's clearly targeted as an EV alternative to something like a BMW X3 or a Mercedes-Benz GLC. Now, about that tax credit, you do have to have $7,500 of federal tax liability in order to get that full tax credit. And it comes off of the top, basically. So you still pay sales tax in the full vehicle. That's not a huge deal with the ID.4. We're talking about maybe $600 of sales tax, and that's $7,500. And then you apply for that on your tax return the next year. You get that off of what you pay the federal government. Now, there are obviously some pros and cons here. The obvious pro is if you finance your vehicle, you get that federal tax hit right now. You get $7,500 back, of course, from the federal government. That's a really good thing. The downside, of course, is that while luxury manufacturers like Tesla are the EV for some, Volkswagen is targeting a broader audience. It's the EV for more. Not quite everyone, but certainly more folks out there will be able to afford it. But that means that more folks out there may not have $7,500 of federal tax liability. If you've got a bunch of child credits, a bunch of other credits going on, keep in mind, you may not get the full benefit. It's also worth noting that Tesla recently decided to discontinue the radar sensor in the Model 3 and Model Y. And as a result, a number of safety outlets have pulled it from their top pick list because they claim that camera-only systems are not going to operate in as wide of a range of operational conditions as the radar sensor-based systems that we find in the ID.4 and most vehicles out there with autonomous emergency braking, especially the more expensive autonomous emergency braking systems that you would expect in a $50,000 to $60,000 luxury car. Now, I'd also say that if you can get your hands on a standard range Model Y for under $40,000, that's a really good deal, especially if you don't qualify for the full federal tax credit. If you do, obviously the ID.4 is still going to be less expensive. The next competitor has to be the Ford Mustang Mach-E. It was released at about the same time as the ID.4. Now, full disclosure, the Alex and Autos channel happens to own a Mustang Mach-E at the moment. We're going to keep it about 6 to 9 months, basically just a few months after Ford releases the hands-off-the-wheel driving system coming sometime later next month. Probably June, July is when we're going to start to know a little bit more about that particular system. But at the moment, we do happen to own one. I think the Mach-E is really tough competition because the price tag is a lot closer, but it is still a little bit more expensive because Ford has been tweaking the price tag and they've also been tweaking some of the incentives. When the Mach-E first launched, there was surprisingly a little bit of cash on the hood, but Ford has tightened things up and retweaked things because the Mach-E has been a little bit more popular than I think they initially thought. It starts at $42,895, so that is more expensive than the ID.4. It's rear-wheel drive, so very much like the ID.4 there, but it has a different personality. The suspension is firmer, it's a little bit bouncier than we find in the ID.4. The ID.4 is tuned more like the average RAV4 or CR-V. It has 230 miles of range versus 250 in the ID.4, but it has a faster 0 to 60 time of 5.8 seconds. It has a smaller cargo area behind the second row seats, but it also has a cargo area in the front trunk, and as a result was able to accommodate a little bit more luggage in my testing. It has bigger screens. The big 15-inch screen in the center is standard. It also has a bigger LCD instrument cluster as well. But then there's that price tag, of course. I think that cancels a lot of that out. All-wheel drive is a little bit less expensive on the Ford at $2,700. That gives you a performance increase as well down to 0 to 60 in 5.2 seconds, but it doesn't come with things like the heated windshield that we find in the Volkswagen. That's why the Volkswagen dual motor option is a bit more expensive. Next up, we have the Chevy Bolt EV. This particular model is new for 2021, but it's logically heavily based on the 2021 Bolt. Basically, what they've done is they've stretched it a little bit to give it a little bit more second row room. They haven't really changed the cargo area too much, and the drivetrain is exactly the same as the regular Bolt. As a result, the Bolt EUV gets a slightly shorter range than the regular Bolt, so a little bit below the ID.4, but honestly fairly close. The big thing to know is that because they didn't change the drivetrain versus the Bolt, they still use the same battery management control systems, etc. It's not going to charge quite as quickly as some of the newest crop of EVs out there. It has a slightly smaller battery, and it does not DC fast charge terribly quickly compared with the Volkswagen ID.4, and the charge rate is positively glacial compared to something like a Tesla Model Y. So the Bolt is a little bit less appropriate, I would say, for longer distance road journeys unless you really like a leisurely experience when road tripping. On the other hand, the Bolt and the Bolt EUV are very, very well priced. The Bolt EUV will start at $33,000. At the moment, GM has not announced any incentives, but they have announced $9,000 of incentives on the regular Bolt without the EUV part. If we get the same incentive on the EUV, that should take it down to about $25,500. And for that price tag, it's pretty rational. Remember that the Bolt does not get any federal tax credit because that tax credit has expired for GM. Next up, we have arguably the first EV for the masses, the Nissan Leaf. The Leaf is often lampooned, but this really was one of the very first EVs designed for mass adoption. Nissan designed the Leaf to be inexpensive to own, inexpensive to operate, and inexpensive to build. That's really important, and that's part of the flaw of the Nissan Leaf. It has an air-cooled battery just like the original one, so battery longevity has been a little bit of a concern, but that has been mitigated by the bigger battery packs that we've seen over the Leaf's generations. At this point in time, you can get a Leaf with up to 226 miles of range. The base model will be 150 miles of range. But the Leaf, because it was originally designed for mass adoption, it's still a front-wheel drive vehicle based heavily on other Nissan platforms, so it's not quite as practical as some of the more modern EVs that are out there. It also has a slower onboard charger, 6.6 kilowatts versus over 10 kilowatts for the modern crop of EVs out there as well. On the other hand, it is really, really inexpensive. It starts at $31,670. Nissan still qualifies for the full $7,500 tax credit, and they're putting a lot of cash on the hood. There is something you should know about the Leaf. Not only is the DC fast charge port optional, it uses a different standard than essentially every other EV in America right now. That's because Nissan was really a pioneer in DC fast charging in North America. And at that point in time, the universal standards that have since been adopted did not exist. So they simply borrowed the DC fast charge standard from Japan, brought it here, and used it. It's a big chunky connector. It's called CHAdeMO. Really nothing else out there uses it. There were a few other EVs, the Soul EV, there was a Mitsubishi Outlander plug-in hybrid that used it, but it has essentially been a Nissan thing. And Nissan is moving away from it. The next generation of Nissan EVs, the upcoming Ariya, it's going to be supporting the new CCS standard that every other EV out there other than Tesla supports. Bottom line, the ID.4 is a very compelling electric vehicle, especially with those 3 years of DC fast charging. It is very much an EV in the mold of a RAV4, a CR-V, a Tiguan. If you're looking for a slightly quirky EV that just has a few little EV quirks here and there, but something that is very easy to integrate into your life if you already own a RAV4, a CR-V, a Tiguan, or whatever, then the ID.4 is going to be an excellent option. But I would say that if you're willing to venture into something that's a little bit different, perhaps a little bit quirky or styled, etc., then you might do well to take a look at the Ford Mustang Mach-E. Keep in mind the Mach-E is going to be more expensive, and it does seem like there is a bit more of a weight on it. If you're to order one today, it looks like the lead time is about 12 to 14 weeks. So order today, get it sometime in perhaps October of 2021. But that said, I think that the Mustang Mach-E is really compelling as well. It is going to be a little bit faster. It seems to feel a little bit better on the road, feel a little bit sportier, although handling is actually really good in the ID.4, mind you. I like the sporty feel of the Mustang, and I think it's a little bit more attractive as well. Let me know what you would pick down there in the comment section below. The ID.4 is absolutely a very, very good EV, however. Let me know what you think about that. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, and I'll see all of you next week.